Merriam-Webster dictionary defines ghosting like this: the act or practice of abruptly cutting off all contact with someone, usually without explanation. Now, the less reputable Urban Dictionary says, ghosting is when a person cuts off all communication with their friends or a person they're dating with zero warning or notice beforehand. And a blog I read that I think says this in a little bit more adult terms says that being ghosted, and I love this phrase, listen to this, is like an ungrieved loss. Oh, isn't that good? Isn't that really good? Like, I thought that one was really good. Like, ghosting, and this, I think this helps us all to get here, because we all need to be in a place where we understand what this is, but an ungrieved loss. And we've all lost someone. What would it be like to not be able to grieve that? Right? Does that make sense? So that's this idea of ghosting. They continued on in their thoughts. They said, when someone dies or move away, there's closure. But when people ghost you, you're left to assume the worst. So again, the fact that ghosting has been added to official and unofficial dictionaries tell me that this is not something that I've just experienced. There are enough head nods in the room this morning that I know that other people here have experienced this. Again, like I said, maybe it's someone you dated, a friend you knew, or a family member who just seemingly disappeared. One way I put this is in a very practical way. Let's just think about it this way. Has anybody ever sent the message and they see that, oh, it's awful. Technology just really screws us up with this, that you can see the read receipt. Have you ever sent a text message and it says read, and you're like, you put it down. Oh, I love it. That's awesome. We just got the talkback sermon. That's fantastic. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, the dots come. Have you ever seen that? Like the bubble starts, boop, 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 and you're like, oh, they're going to say something. And then it goes, poof. And then it's boop, 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 poof. And then you see the third one, and you know they're about to send you a paragraph. You are about to get smoked. And then they don't. It just goes poof. And then you just think, what did I do? Now, the worst thing is when you talk to that person, and Renee, have you ever had this happen? You talk to that person, you go, are you okay? Yeah, why? Well, I wrote you that message, and then like you started writing, and then you just sort of like stopped. Oh, yeah, it's fine. We were at Chick-fil-A. We were just getting food. I just forgot. Turn off your read receipts. Seriously, because you're hurting people. You are harming people with your read receipts, okay? So if you are like me and you struggle with attention, please turn off your read receipts. Just do everybody a favor. But it gets worse, though. Have you ever been blocked on social media by somebody? You said, how did that happen? Why did that happen? And they don't tell you why. They just do it. Now, here's what I want to be cautious about before we go any further. I want to be cautious because I want to say this very clearly. Ghosting is not always a bad thing. If someone is emotionally or physically abusive, shut the door and walk away. Protect yourself, protect loved ones. That is a just approach to certain relationships. You do not owe someone who is physically and emotionally abusive anything but a closed door. That is absolutely fine. You don't even have to leave a little mail slot to talk to them. Just shut the door and walk away. If you're the perpetrator in that scenario, you need to stop. And you also need to realize that person does not owe you any explanation for why they walked away. You are being a terrible person. I'm trying not to look at anybody. You're being a terrible person, and the door was shut, and you need to be okay with it. The ghosting we're talking about is not a protective behavior of safety. The ghosting we're talking about is this. It is an evasion, and here's how I want to think about this. It's an evasion to avoid uncomfortable conversation by people exhibiting the inability to handle complex situations and emotions. Does that make sense? So they are evading uncomfortable conversations by exhibiting an inability to handle complex situations and emotions. But here's what's sad. What's sad is it has almost become a justifiable approach by our immature society. What started out as a teenage reality has started shifting into all of society. I mean, guys, people in here have probably been ghosted by HR because they're just afraid of being honest with you. Some of you have been ghosted in ways that you go, that doesn't make any sense. People shouldn't be like that. But it's an immaturity and an inability to have and handle tough conversations. The reality is that this is the reality of this, that the phrase ghosted does sound childish. And honestly, the behavior should probably be described that way. It's childish. But here's what I want to make sure we're clear of. The mental health effects on the receiving end are harmful to everyone in the relationship. Not just the person who was ghosted, but the ghostee is also exhibiting and living out harmful realities in their relationships. Now, we could find a lot of ways, healthy and unhealthy ways, to handle being ghosted. Healthy might look like taking your shopping cart and going the other direction. Unhealthy might look like picking up one of those frozen sausages and hitting somebody across the face. That is not a healthy way to handle being ghosted. It's probably also not a healthy way to handle being ghosted by continuing the messages. Stop sending the text messages. Just stop. Just let it go. Because it's just more and more and more hurt. It doesn't do anything to help us. Another way you could talk to a mental health professional about being ghosted. Share with them, hey, this is the reality that I experienced in my life, and I need help navigating this. Could you help me? We can also share our heart with people that we love and say, hey, look, this is what happened in my life. Can we just talk about it? I guarantee you the person's going to look at you and say, yep, happened to me too. Sometimes we just need friends who look at us and go, me too. Me too. You don't have to give advice. You don't have to be an expert. That's the wonderful thing about church. Did you know that? The wonderful thing about church is you can literally just look at someone and just go, I know, me too. Me too. Now, what you won't find is you won't find the term ghosting in the Bible. And then you think, but Ryan, you're preaching a sermon about ghosting. And I struggled with this because I looked and I said, I really want to talk about this, but I don't know that I can find the scripture that really talks about this. And I want to be careful here because as a pastor, this is like the most dangerous thing you can do. You say, I want to talk about this. Let me find the text that backs up this. That's what I normally do not do that. Normally I have the text and then we talk about the text and what it can teach us. But in this thing, it was a hey, we want to talk about this issue. But then I started reading some authors and some people who wrote some blogs. And there was this incredible blog that I read about a woman who had experienced being ghosted. And she had found a passage that really helped her find comfort in her experience. So I said, you know what? I love what she wrote. I want to share some of what she had to say with us and how she used that text because I think it was done so very well. Now, the author found this passage. It was Psalm 55, and it has so much to teach us about being ghosted. Here's how it starts out. It says this, listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked. For they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm. This is such a beautiful song and such a beautiful poem and such a beautiful psalm that talks about this idea that this is King David writing, that he is experiencing all this fear, all this trouble, all this stuff happening in his life. And he sort of looks and says, oh, if I could just go away. If I could just get on an airplane, hopefully not Spirit, and fly to Cabo and I could just go to the beach and get away from all of this trouble, that's what I would do. He's like, if I could just fly there myself and get out of all of this mess, that is exactly, is this not great? This is great, isn't it? Like, this is a prayer that we can pray. God, I just need a sabbatical. That's what David's saying. He's like, I just got to get out of here. Now, again, this psalm was written by King David at a really difficult moment in his life, and that difficulty is on full display here. Again, he opens up, and I love this. He opens this up, I put this in my notes, and hopefully Emily listens to this later, with the honesty that you would see in like a Taylor Swift song. The dude is just being honest. He is scared. His enemies are after him. He wants to run away. But here's the interesting thing about this. It's not just a prayer about him expressing his fear. It's a song written to God as a prayer. As David reflected on all this stuff that's happening to him, do you see what he does here? He takes all of this and all of that burden to God. And that's the very first thing that I want us to see in this psalm, is that we can bring anything that we are going through to God. And here's what I wonder. I wonder how many of us think, God isn't really interested in my personal problems. Yeah, I wonder, maybe God has better things to worry about than my hurts. Maybe God has better things to do than worry because I've been ghosted by someone. Except what we find out is that's exactly what this psalm is about. This is incredible. Most scholars will conclude that David wrote this psalm during a series of events that probably felt like David's entire life was falling apart. We find the story, the background of this psalm in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is really amazing. It's sort of like, it's kind of like Game of Thrones in print. I mean, it's really like the Game of Thrones of the Bible, and I'm serious. David's son Absalom had been building up this army and all of these people to help him to overthrow his father. It's this story of just incredible betrayal. There's all sorts of, like, in the story, I'm serious, there's like war, there's pride, there's sex. I mean, honestly, it makes Game of Thrones look tame by comparison if you read it. But in this series of events that are taking place in this story, we find David, who has experienced, again, all of this betrayal from his son and all of his companions, all of these people. He feels completely lost. He feels terror. He feels horror at what's taking place. In 2 Samuel 15, we get to the critical part of the story, but it's the end of the verses at 30 and 31 that we see the background then to this psalm that he wrote. Listen to this as David sees his future in doubt. He says this. It says, David continued up the Mount of Olives. So he had fled Jerusalem. He was trying to find a place of safety that he could go. He continues up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their head too, and they were weeping as they went. Now, again, why does it matter what they're wearing? Well, that was a way to describe kind of what they were going through. This is how they experienced sort of this absolute sadness. So if you ever read in Scripture, it talks about they put on sackcloth. Well, they sat and they just wept. We don't do that. Like, this is the lament. And they were okay telling that they had an experience of lament. Well, then it goes on, it says, now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, if we didn't know anything, we'd just scan past this. But in an earlier part of the story, we discovered that this Ahithophel was one of David's closest confidants and counselors. He was the person that David went to for all of the things that were like the most important things that he had going on in his kingdom. He would come to him and say, hey, I need your help thinking through this. I need to figure out this. And he became that second in command, sort of closest companion that he could possibly have. And then he finds out that this guy had betrayed him. He had walked away and he had joined Absalom in this betrayal and in this conspiracy. So with that in mind, I want us to imagine, what did David feel as he was preparing to leave the city? I want you to sort of imagine him turning, and he's walking with all these people in his sackcloth, and he goes, "Hey, Ahithophel, I need to talk to you. Where are you?" And then maybe in our modern day, maybe if it was today, he would have texted him, and he would have been like, "Where are you at?" And maybe the text would show red. Maybe he would then try to call, and he'd be like, "I don't know if you know, Absalom has taken over the castle. Could you, he's in the city. Could you call me back?" Voicemail. Then he calls again. It either rings and rings and rings and goes voicemail, or my favorite, right? It just goes click, and you're like, "Oh, no." And you sort of just know what was happening in that moment. And then his friends look and say, "Well, here's what happened, David. Your good friend is no longer here. He's ghosted you, and he's joined the enemy." So being ghosted like this felt to David like an absolute betrayal. And here's the question that we ask then. How could this friend just walk away after all that they had been together? How could he just leave him like that? And can you hear now with that as the background, can you hear how Psalm 55 sort of grows out of this like a plant? All of this is sort of the soil of this psalm. All of this just awful stuff, this betrayal. His life is a wreck, and he's looking for his friend, and his friend is gone. And then David writes on. He continues in Psalm 55 then. After all of that, "If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me," he says, "I could hide." See, now do you see the personal thing here? If it was anybody else, I'd be fine. If it was somebody who was really like, again, have you ever been betrayed by somebody like that? And you were like, if it was anybody else, I'd be fine. But it was you. Why was it you? And it just stings, and we can feel what he's going through here. He says, "But it is you." And then he goes on, he says, "A man like myself, my companion, my close friend." And then listen what he says. "With whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked among the worshipers." David is like, this like stings so hard. He's like, we used to go to church together. He's like, we used to worship God together. We used to pray together and sing together. We used to talk about things of God together, and like that was our experience together. And he says, and now you're just gone. So I think if we look closely, we can see the conflict that David was experiencing. His pain is that his friend has walked away. Again, he'd rather it be an enemy or someone he could fight. And then here's what I think is really interesting about how he writes this. It's the pain of what they had that they no longer have that hurts them most. Do you see that? He's not even focused on the betrayal, really. He ends it with, we once had this. Like at one time, we did this together. The pain of what we had that we no longer have hurts the most, and that's what leaves us with the ungrieved loss. And David is wrestling with that, and it takes him to a really dark place. Listen to what he says next. He says, "Let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead." Woo! "For evil finds lodging among them." Now, this is one of those really interesting places, because this is really hard for us. We read this and go, I thought, Ryan, that we weren't supposed to wish bad for our enemies. Like, isn't that like a bad thing to do? Aren't we supposed to love our enemies? Like, what is going on in the Bible here? Well, this is actually a really cool place. This is a long-standing tradition that we actually see in the Psalms that most of the time in church we ignore. The reason you don't see scriptures like this is because a lot of pastors were uncomfortable preaching this because it seems to go so against what we experience in church. But in reality, this is a deep tradition among the Jewish people and something that we need to learn. This is called an imprecatory psalm. And there's just a little snippet of right in Psalm 55. So not to go too long, I preached on this before, but I want to share this with you. Imprecatory psalms are usually entire songs with a theme pleading for God to address perpetrators of injustice, people who have hurt you. The point of them is to show that God, and here's the point, is to show that God is in the best place to handle our anger, frustration, and distress. And what it's doing is it's saying, I don't need to hold on to this anymore. And I'm giving it to the one person who can handle that. Now, that doesn't mean we don't come to a place where we realize that's probably not the right thing to think about with my enemies. But again, we're giving it away. Does that make sense? We're giving it away. And that's what he's doing here. He's giving away what he feels and says, whatever happens to them, I just give it up. Just take it. But David trusts that his fate will look different. Listen to this. He says, as for me, I call to God and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress and he hears my voice. Now, this is so huge. Again, David gives us these honest words in scriptures. And if we learn just one thing today, I hope you're learning this. It's okay to be honest with God. But this honesty goes even deeper here. Because here's what's crazy. This psalm about ghosting, being ghosted by his friend and his companion, this psalm is actually even rooted deeper in something else. So if we dig down into the pot of the layers, so we've got this psalm, and then we've got the story of 2 Samuel where his friend is betraying him. But if we dig even deeper in the soil of David's faith, we will find that he actually had felt ghosted by God. We find that in Psalm 22, just 30 psalms before. Listen to this. In that psalm, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the cries of my anguish? I love this. David is not afraid to look and say, God, stop ghosting me. How many times have you prayed to God and said, God, would you please stop ghosting me? I'm really getting sick of you not ghosting me. Why have you given up on me? Why are you doing this? And here's what's amazing about this. These people who felt abandoned that wrote stuff like this, like David, the people who collected and learned and sang these psalms, who actually put this in here, it would have been great to be like, oh no, King David, he always had faith. He was, no, everything's fine. No, they were like, let's be honest about it. He wrote a psalm about feeling ghosted by God because we need to hear that, and people in the future need to hear that and know that it's okay. God can handle all of that. And even Jesus said this psalm. Did you know that? In Mark 15, it says at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, there is so much going on theologically at that moment that nobody will ever know or understand. People can try to make ideas and talk about ontologically and theologically and metaphysically what's happening between God the Father and God the Son in that moment, but nobody will ever figure it out. And I think trying to actually causes us to miss out on the major point here, that in that moment, Jesus fully understands what it means to be human. He understands pain, he understands suffering, and even in that moment, Jesus knows what it feels like to be abandoned. But Jesus knew where the psalm actually went too. Listen to the rest of the psalm. Yet, what a huge word. My God, why have you forsaken me? You're screaming it out, shouting it out, and then a yet comes to tug on you this direction. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. My God, you have forsaken me, yet you're the one that Israel praises. My God, you have forsaken me, yet our ancestors put their trust in you. And you delivered them. My God, why have you forsaken me? Yet my ancestors cried out to you, and they were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. So David knew that God could handle despair and frustration. He wasn't scared to share that any of that with God. He also knew what God had done, and because of that, he knew he could trust in what God was going to do. So look at the rich potting soil that is this psalm about being ghosted. In it, we have the first layer, which is that David knew what it was like to be ghosted by God. So if you have felt like you have been ghosted and abandoned by God, you are in a great tradition of King David, of the Israelites, and of Jesus himself. That is the deep richness of this soil. And then on top of that soil, though, gets this other layer that David sort of begins to mix in with that. And he says, yet, even in those times, I imagine him going, dang it. Even in those times when I want to be mad, I know what he's done. And I can't figure it out, but I know what he's going to do. And so he builds this soil of trust. So then, when this plant begins to form, this other story of being betrayed by a human in his life, he can look and go, I'm okay. Because you know what? This person might ghost me because they're a human just like me. And they're going to betray me and they're going to walk away. But I know that I can share that pain with God. I know that I can share that sadness with God. I know I can share the fears with God. I can share the grief, the ungrieved loss with God. And I know that he's not going to walk away.